SEP FanFic Readings presents Thanks to the Photographs by Unstable Hufflepuff. Chapter 5 Draco and Hermy. To say that Hermione was tired would be an understatement. She had spent the majority of her childhood editing Harry's and Ron's homework, helping them with their spell work and reteaching them the lessons they hadn't paid attention to. She thought teaching would come easier to her. She had failed to factor in the new variable, the fact that many of her new students thought she was a joke. By the end of her first week, she was exhausted, emotionally drained, and ready to snap at anybody who looked her way. It wasn't like she and Malfoy could get drunk every night that week in order to relieve their stress. Thankfully, it was now Friday, and that night they were, once again, sitting in Neville's office with several bottles of wine and fire whiskey. This time, however, Hermione, Malfoy, Neville, and Veronica were joined by Luna and Hannah Abbott, who was spending the weekend there with Neville. It was an interesting dynamic, to say the least. Hannah acted as though she were Veronica's mother by forcing her to drink water and eat little cupcakes with flowers on them that Luna had brought in order to soak up the alcohol she was consuming. Luna told pleasantly ridiculous tales of her travels with her fiancé, Rolf Scamander, that made everyone gape at her and Veronica simply laugh. Neville was so confident in Hannah's presence that he reminded Hermione of Ron when he started seeing Lavender in their 6th year. The similarities were unsettling, to say the least. Lastly, Malfoy couldn't look Luna directly in the eye, even when speaking to her, and every time she glanced at him, she got a faraway look on her face that held no wonder of curiosity whatsoever, just sadness. The same had been the case when Hermione, along with Ginny and Luna, had returned to Hogwarts for their 8th year after the defeat of Voldemort. Even after Ginny had punched Malfoy directly in the face in the middle of the entrance hall and then proceeded to shake his hand, Luna was still a little wary of him. Hermione wondered if she had ever been wary of anything before. Luna had always been fearless in her eyes, whether the situation called for it or not. Malfoy could clearly sense her discomfort, though, and, as a result, sat silently in his armchair, only speaking when spoken to. Hermione was curled up in the armchair next to him, both of them facing the sofa opposite that held the others. She felt as though they were both watching a film, viewing whilst unable to interact. Distinctly outsiders. She wondered if this feeling, being an outsider in your own life, was new to him, as she sipped from her own goblet, the alcohol leaving a pool of warmth in her stomach. It was likely. She, on the other hand, had not felt this way since she first started at Hogwarts, back when Harry and Ron had rescued her from a troll, and the idea of friendship was just that, an idea. It had been the loneliest time of her entire life at that point, and now she was here again, just over a decade later, feeling exactly like that buck-toothed and bushy-haired 11-year-old. Granger. Hermione glanced sideways at Malfoy, blinking rapidly to clear her thoughts. He was holding a pack of cigarettes up for her to see, waving it slightly as if to entrance her. "Fancy a bit of fresh air?" he asked in a whisper, raising an eyebrow at her. She smiled and shook her head, but drained her goblet and stood up nonetheless. "I'm not sure going out for a smoke can be referred to as getting fresh air, but all right." She tapped Neville on the shoulder to get his attention. "Malfoy and I will be back in a bit, okay?" He stared at her for a second, his eyes darting between her and Malfoy before nodding his head. "Okay." The second Hermione and Malfoy reached the courtyard outside, he handed her a cigarette and placed a second one between his lips. He then gestured for her to come closer, simultaneously drawing his wand. They stood only a few inches apart, heads bowed together, while he lit their cigarettes with an effortless flick of his wrist. At this time of year, it was still fairly warm out during the day, as long as you remained in the sun. But the sun had long since gone down, leaving them standing there in the chilly moonlight, drawing warmth from their cigarettes to burn their lungs with. They slowly filled the air around them with smoke that disappeared into each gust of wind, neither of them looking at the other. "Thought you'd be in a better mood tonight," Malfoy said suddenly, his voice not teasing, but contemplative. She wondered what he had to contemplate. "You know, catching up with old friends and that." "I suppose I'm still getting used to being back here," said Hermione heavily, exhaling a puff of smoke away from them both. "It just feels strange, hanging out with people as though the last 2 years didn't happen." She saw him nod out of the corner of her eye. "It's different with Harry and Ginny," she went on, and she blamed her loose tongue on the wine. "There was never any strain. They always understood. Being so close with them for so long. 2 years away doesn't change anything." I know what you mean, said Malfoy. Back then, when the war finally came to an end, it was easier than I thought it'd be to... He paused for a moment, seeming to consider his words. My friends were very understanding, even after everything I'd done. It was almost as if nothing had ever happened. Nothing had changed. Hermione frowned a bit, taking a long drag in a half-hearted attempt to keep herself from speaking her mind. She was, however, not too good at that. These friends, do I know them? Goyle is still in Azkaban for what he did the last year of Hogwarts, when Professor Snape was headmaster, and Crabbe, I don't recall you spending much time with anyone apart from them. She turned her head slightly to look at him, but as Malfoy opened his mouth to respond, she found herself smirking. Well, Pansy Parkinson, I suppose, she said, and he shut his mouth, grimacing. She was practically a constant accessory of yours for a few good years there. Could say the same about the weasel, he said, raising an eyebrow at her. He smirked when she glared at him. Exactly. Now, shut up about Pansy, Granger. She couldn't help it. She giggled, then rolled her eyes at herself and took another drag. When she looked at him again, he was watching her in amusement. I think we've reached the point where we don't have to call each other by our surnames anymore, she said. Don't you, Draco? Malfoy made an odd face and shook his head. That just sounds weird coming from your mouth. Oh, does it bother you, Draco? She asked innocently. Stop, he said, wrinkling his nose. Just no. What's the matter, Draco? Said Hermione, in a falsely sweet tone reminiscent of Dolores Umbridge. She poked him at his side, smiling. Come on, Draco, say my name. Malfoy just shook his head, staring at her, and looked fairly disturbed. She poked him again, laughing, and he took a step back. Stop it. This is weird. Her, she poked him again. My, again. Oh, she stabbed him in the ribs. Knee. She stepped up to him when he backed away again, getting right up in his face and grinning broadly. Hermione, say it. He shook his head profusely. Come on, Draco, I dare you. Say my name. Let's just go back inside, Granger, he said uncomfortably, stomping out his cigarette. He took out his wand and vanished both his and hers non-verbally. This is getting too weird for me. Hermione grabbed him by the wrist when he attempted to turn back towards the doors of the castle, laughing again. She had never seen him so uncomfortable before, and it satisfied her more than she cared to admit. Do it, Draco, she chortled, tightening her grip when he tried to pull away. Her, my, oh, knee. Hermione, say it. Her, my, oh, she grinned. Ninny. Malfoy finished proudly, and she scowled. There, said it. Let's go. No, that's cheating, snapped Hermione. Come on, Ferret, say my name. Hermy, own. Draco. Hair, my, knee. Draco. Hero, my, nigh. You're insufferable, she cried, giving him a playful shove and making him laugh as he staggered backwards. I hate you. You know that? It's not that hard. If memory serves correctly, your Bulgarian beau couldn't pronounce it either, said Malfoy, his eyes bright with amusement. He then ducked, laughing still when she swung at him. You didn't seem to mind then. But then again, I'm sure he was making up for it in other areas that I'm not. Hermione growled in frustration and shouldered past him, heading back into the castle and throwing her arms up in defeat. I give up, she cried as he followed her, chuckling. I need more alcohol in order to deal with you right now. The feeling is mutual, my dearest Hermy. I'm going to kill you. Malfoy placed a hand over his heart, feigning sadness. You wound me, Hermy. Ow! He added when she elbowed him in the gut. What the fuck was that for? What if I was to start calling you by your middle name, huh? She asked sternly. Would you like that, Lucius? He stopped in his tracks, staring at her with his mouth agape. For a split second, Hermione worried she had gone too far. But then he lunged forward and flung her over his shoulder, laughing as she yelped in surprise. Put me down, Malfoy! Oh, so it's back to Malfoy now, is it? Face scrunched up in determination, Hermione reached into his trousers and yanked up his pants with all her might, making Malfoy squeal like a child and pinch her arse in retaliation, just as they turned into the next corridor. She let out a shriek of laughter, squirming in his arms, and was faintly surprised when he came to a halt and immediately set her down. She glared up at him, opening her mouth to reprimand him, when she realized he wasn't even looking at her, but rather something behind her. Frowning, she turned around and gasped. 2 Gryffindor prefects, who had clearly been on rounds, ensuring no one was out past curfew, were standing at the end of the corridor, gaping at their professors. The boy, Hermione remembered him leering at her in class, appeared to be on the verge of laughter, and the girl was just horrified. Hermione cleared her throat awkwardly. Sorry about that," she said, and the boy snorted. "Best be on your way now. Run along." She made a shooing motion when neither moved, and the girl grabbed her classmate by the arm and dragged him back the way they'd come. "Well, shit." Malfoy roared with laughter. She snapped her head around to glare at him, finding him hunched over, clutching his stomach and wiping tears from his eyes. In spite of herself, she, too, began to laugh, and soon they were both bracing themselves on their knees, gasping for air. When they'd both finally caught their breath, a good 5 minutes later, Malfoy said plainly, "That's definitely going to come back to bite us in the arse." And he was right. Come Monday morning, it seemed that half of Hogwarts had heard about their charms and transfiguration professors being caught drunkenly wandering the castle late at night, and it was all any of them were talking about. A 4th-year Ravenclaw boldly interrupted Hermione's lesson on Gamp's Law to ask if she was shagging the Death Eater. She gaped at him, spluttering, and several of the students began snickering. One girl, who sat front and center in the front row, muttered something under her breath about thinking she could stoop no lower. This behavior carried on for most of the week. On Tuesday, Hermione arrived at her classroom to find the words "Death Eater's Whore" printed across her door in bright red letters. She made sure to get rid of it before Malfoy saw, and could hardly make eye contact with him during mealtimes that day. On Wednesday afternoon, a first-year girl started sobbing in the middle of class, and when Hermione finally managed to calm her down, the girl exclaimed that she'd betrayed all her fellow Muggleborns. While she was marking essays in her office on Thursday evening, she came across one with no name, that contained nothing but an incredibly graphic drawing of her on her knees for Malfoy, who was drawn wearing Death Eater robes and a mask. She crumpled it up in a ball and set it aflame. By Friday morning, Hermione was fuming. She was stabbing her eggs at breakfast with such vehemence that Neville scooted his chair further down the table to get away from her, and Veronica, for once, said nothing. Malfoy merely stared at his plate with a solemn expression and didn't eat a thing. When the bell rang, signaling the start of classes, Hermione was not, as she usually was, waiting patiently in her classroom for her students to arrive. No, she was done with that. She had wanted to be liked. She had wanted them to respect her. But that clearly wasn't happening. She had reached her wit's end, and it was now time to take a page out of Severus Snape's book. The 5th-year Hufflepuff and Slytherins were standing outside her classroom, chatting amongst themselves and laughing, when she stormed into the corridor. They all looked up in surprise when she waved her wand at the door and it flung open with an echoing bang. "Inside!" she growled. "Now!" The students each looked at her with varying expressions of shock and apprehension, but did as they were told, and slowly made their way into the classroom. She followed them in, slamming the door shut behind her, and waved her wand again as they tried to take their seats, separating each desk so that none of them could be next to their friends. There would be no whispering and snickering to each other any more. Hermione snapped at them to all take their seats when many hesitated, looking unsure, and stomped up the center aisle to her desk, slamming her wand down and turning to glare at them all with her hands on her hips. "I have had enough of your blatant disrespect," she said furiously, and several students exchanged nervous looks. "I don't care what you think of me or what your opinions are on my personal life may be, because frankly, what I do outside this classroom is none of your goddamn business. I don't know what makes you think you have the right to treat me the way you have, but I am sick of it. Do you understand?" One Slytherin boy raised his hand tentatively, frowning. "Professor, I think you're overreact—" "Did I give you permission to speak?" snapped Hermione, and he bowed his head, going pink in the face. "That's what I thought. You're all, what, 15? Maybe 16. You remember Hogwarts when Voldemort was in power, don't you?" Many of them nodded, their eyes downcast. Others frowned, looking suspicious as to where she was going with this. "I am sorry that you all had to face that," said Hermione angrily. "You were children. You didn't deserve any of the treatment you received under the Carrows. You should have been safe. You should have been able to learn in a secure, risk-free environment. But you know what? I gave up my entire childhood for each and every one of you. I just about threw my life away to help take down Voldemort. I gave up my own parents, and this is the thanks I get." She stared at them all, slightly out of breath and trembling with rage. Though many of them looked properly scolded, she was not yet satisfied. "And you think you have the right to say that I betrayed you," she said scathingly, and one girl flinched. "Now, the time you are provided in this classroom is for the study of transfiguration. If a single one of you mentions anything that is not directly related to the subject, you will spend every Friday night for a month cleaning the bedpans in the hospital wing, without magic. And if I hear you so much as utter the name Ron Weasley, you will be asked to leave. Have I made myself clear?" She had never seen so many people nod their heads so quickly. It looked almost dizzying. Letting out a breath, she turned to the blackboard, picked up her wand again. Waving it at the board, the subject of the day's lesson appeared written there in neat cursive. She looked back to her class and plastered a smile across her face. "Now, who can tell me about vanishing spells?"